Not coordinating the Alliance for Future Generations anymore, but I am quite involved in a fairly new alliance of NGOs, civil society groups and individuals working in the UK to bring the needs of future generations into the heart of UK democracy and policy processes in order to safeguard the earth and secure intergenerational justice. Now that's a UK grouping, and we've actually, I'm not coordinating because we've very recently decided to equally share the coordination across a much larger group of people, but Peter's also involved in it as one of the individual members, and happy to tell you more about that. But what I want to talk to you about today is it not working?
Could you kindly hold the microphone?
It's not working.
Maybe mine's not working. That one's not working.
No, it's working. Okay.
When I start,
It's the mic's not working. None of them are working.
none of them work.
So it's the amplifier.
So I'll just speak more loudly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or maybe stand up and project.
Yeah.
So, what I want to talk about is not the UK Alliance for Future Generations, but a proposal that is officially on the agenda for Rio+20. Now, the Rio+20 agenda has about 4 elements. One of them is renewing the political commitments made 20 years ago in the original Rio Earth Summit, the UN Conference on Environment and Development. The second one is taking stock of emerging challenges. And then the third and the fourth, in a sense, have more substantive proposals behind them. The third one is the green economy in the context of the imperative for poverty reduction and sustainable development. And that's where lots and lots of ideas are being developed around sort of green economy roadmaps, and the real risk is that what governments will talk about is a kind of slightly greening the capitalist system around the edges without the kind of root and branch reform that's needed. And the fourth agenda is where what I want to talk about comes in. That now works, does it? Which is an agenda on institutional frameworks for sustainable development. And part of that is lots of UN agencies kind of toing and froing and saying, how do we make the United Nations environmental programme stronger? And then there's other people saying, we've got this Commission for Sustainable Development and it's proved to be a bit ineffective and not very authoritative, and actually only environment ministers and none of the Treasury or finance people go along to it, so we need to transform that by creating a Council for Sustainable Development. And then one of the other proposals in that agenda is to create an ombudsperson or a High Commissioner for future generations. And I'm waving these papers because I'm going to read the exact language. It's pretty weak, but it's in there in the official so-called zero draft negotiating text. It says, we agree to further consider the establishment of an ombudsperson or High Commissioner for future generations to promote sustainable development. Now, that proposal comes out of a number of zero draft submissions. Zero draft is the jargon for the kind of the blueprint text that hasn't yet been negotiated among governments. That's the starting point for the negotiations. And in the process leading to that, governments and civil society groups across, well, in the UN it's divided across 9 so-called major groups, were invited to make submissions. And there was a significant number of those submissions supported the idea of something with the title High Commissioner or Ombudsperson. Some of them were for proposing these beasties at national level rather than globally, and there are a variety of reasons that people offered. So some people wanted to see something like this in order to strengthen implementation of environment law. Some people coming out of the global system saw that a High Commissioner for Sustainable Development, a bit like the High Commissioner for Human Rights or for refugees, would add that kind of international leadership to the global sustainable development agenda. And if you like, numerically more significantly, the proposals for this High Commissioner for Future Generations or Ombudsperson for Future Generations came out of the insight that we are systematically failing in our governance structures to deliver our responsibility to think long-term about the interests and the needs of future generations. So, I'm working with some other people now to, in a sense, amplify the civil society campaign for a High Commissioner for Future Generations based on that starting point, that we have a very significant problem, governance challenge, because states thinking as states and governments and elected representatives tend to think short term. And at the national level and at the subnational level, elected representatives tend to think in terms of short-term electoral cycles. And then at the global level, rather than very often governments go up to the United Nations and they're thinking about their self-interest as states. Now, luckily, there is a basis in the United Nations for a very strong argument that the United Nations should be doing this. This is not an argument that you simply have to make on moral grounds. The United Nations Charter, its preamble, is determined to protect succeeding generations from the scourge of war. So future generations are in there, right, built into the mission of the United Nations. And what greater security challenges do we now face than social injustice, lack of democracy, the evisceration, if I can use that word, in some parts of the world of our natural environment and our natural and cultural heritage as well. And so there is a strong case based on the mission of the United Nations itself to be made for a High Commissioner for Future Generations, or some kind of advocate or leadership on future generations. If you like, a keeper of the idea that now is not just in the present, now extends into the future as well. The long now is the idea that Stuart Brand has proposed. And yet the political reality, for all that the United Nations is equipped to think long term, has been so very different time and time again. So the proposal is there, and the proposal that I've been working on, Peter's also been involved a bit looking at comparative insights from the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the High Commissioner for Refugees, which already exist. So the proposal that we're going to be putting forward in a more detailed paper later this week with the World Future Council as well is that there needs to be a High Commissioner for Future Generations to promote and protect the interests of future generations in the context of the imperative to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And the reason that it's got that long-winded mission, if you like, is because it's going back to basics. It's going back to the basic definition of sustainable development that was adopted and has widely been used around the world, that initially came from this World Commission on Environment and Development. And the reason not to say this is a High Commissioner for Future Generations working in the context of sustainable development is that, very sadly, I think the current appetite among states for interpreting sustainable development does simply not match up to that original aspiration reflected in the report of the World Commission on Environment and Development. So then there are all sorts of issues which I won't go into in very much detail on. What would a High Commissioner for Future Generations do? How can you make sure, in a sense, that by putting such a function, an institution, into the heart of the United Nations system, that it doesn't simply end up being bogged down by bureaucracy or just being a talking shop or simply itself reflecting all of the flaws of the United Nations? And one of the ideas behind it is that this institution should be capable of inspiring, not requiring, but inspiring change from the bottom up as well. And another one of the key principles should be that this office of the High Commissioner for Future Generations should be very much connected to people's movements and to people, so that it's not the United Nations from the top down dictating to states who have not yet accepted legal commitments systematically across future generations, dictating to them what should happen. It should be about working with people's movements around the world, being ready to receive representations from people and where they see their structures and governance systems falling down. Many people would like to see it having a formal complaints function. There are about 30 treaties, international treaties, that refer to future generations. But sadly, we're not yet at the stage, I think, where it's feasible to begin calling for, in the context of Rio+20, a global convention on responsibilities to future generations with a kind of complaints function attached to it. I think that there are very genuinely issues about how do we actually operationalise a commitment to future generations, where I'm not convinced that we've yet got bright answers. It's clear to me that we can't specify how many years we should be considering future generations for, because the time scale is dependent on the subject matter under consideration. It's very clear that there's a very great challenge. It's very clear that states recognise that there's a challenge, and it's also clear that in setting up this institution, it has to be set up so it can drive change on the ground, as well as acting as an authoritative voice within the United Nations, a keeper of the long now, if you like. So the paper's due out later this week, and it's just a discussion paper, so it's designed to breathe some life into this proposal that is on the table for Rio+20, which I think really needs a lot more support and creative thinking as well on what it could look like in practice and what might actually work in order for it to come out the other end after the conference in Rio in June. Thank you.